pleasure of being joined by Tim Bond from the DMA UK, and he's going to be talking to us about where he's come from in marketing. He actually contributes to an interview in the book as well, and really sharing some nuggets and insights from what he's gleaned during his experience. So, Tim, how did you get into marketing? How did it all start?
Hi, Jenna. Thanks for having me again, and thanks again for including me in the book. But I think so. Originally, I'm actually a social scientist by training. I studied for my MA in sociology from the Granite City of Aberdeen University way back when, and then before joining the DMA, I actually spent about 10 years working in agencies, primarily working across kind of communications and market research, and that led to a lot of clients in various sectors. But the one that always kind of really interested and excited me was marketing and retail services. So those businesses that kind of support the brands that we all know and love, and that kind of led to some work with the DMA. So then when a role came up there that kind of fit my skills, I frankly jumped at it.
And what does your role currently involve at the DMA?
Yeah, so I'm currently the head of insight, and a key part of that is obviously developing what we term actionable insight for the industry that we represent, which is the data and marketing industry. We also support the association's kind of core belief in putting the customer first and trying to lead businesses into that with kind of creativity and innovation, all bred by the kind of research that we do and I help to oversee.
What would your kind of like top advice be for any aspiring marketers?
Yeah, I think it's kind of twofold, really. First is to listen to customers, speak to them where you can, and actually take that information in, whether it's through data or actually through contact. Make sure that you put that customer first. I mean, it's a core part of everything that we believe at the DMA. And secondly, probably won't be too surprising, but it's data. Really, don't be afraid of it. You don't have to be a kind of a high-grade mathematician to be able to start to understand what data can show you, and it's not something to be scared of, because there can be experts in every team that can really do some of that hard work, but then knowing how you can then use it is really key in this day and age.
Such a good point about not being scared of data, because sometimes you just see the fear in marketers' eyes when they get presented with like a spreadsheet or some data or some insight, and it's kind of moving away from that and asking the questions of what is this data telling you? It's like the next stage on from that.
Exactly, yeah.
So in the book, in the interview, you highlight that it's consumers that will lead the change. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so I remember that was about particularly the future, wasn't it? And kind of what marketing holds. And I think for me, it's all about change. Because the world is constantly in evolution, but it's not necessarily where you always think it's going to be. I'm a big believer that nothing stays the same, and I love new things as well, as many marketers do. We're sometimes guilty of being in favour of the new shiny toy, but also I'm actually a bit of a cynic at heart. So while I see opportunities with so many technologies to change like how we market to customers, I also see the barriers quite quickly as well. So I believe as marketers that we don't get to decide as much as we necessarily think we do either. It's the consumers that will lead that change, because we need to meet them where they want to be. Just look at trends that have exploded in our consciousness and then fallen away by the wayside over the last 10 years. Ultimately, customer is king, and always has been and always will be. And we do well to remember that, as well as listen to them, as I already mentioned.
Yeah, such a good point. I think especially now during times of COVID, when there's been such big changes in habits and how people are purchasing, and you must have lots of insights into that, and that should drive change in businesses' operation and marketing.
Exactly. I mean, I was just on a webinar earlier today, and we were discussing there how some of these trends, none of them have come out of nowhere, right? We've been watching consumer trends for years at the DMA, and most of them are just accelerations of things that we've been seeing in recent years. And yes, it's vastly accelerated them, but I almost wonder whether that's also triggered some businesses to have to shift, because they haven't been able to rely on, in-store experiences and face-to-face contact, where maybe they have kind of been unwilling to change in the past. And that's meant that those accelerations that had already started happening have just gone into, stratospheric levels, because businesses have finally kind of switched over to allowing things like, even relatively simple things that probably should have been implemented sooner around, chat customer service and those kinds of options. You've got those great people on the end of phones. Why not make them able to manage those conversations through instant messengers, which actually a lot of consumers prefer as well, particularly the younger ones coming through.
Yeah, do you think it's almost forced? I mean, I know that, we talk about this a lot, and it is like core fundamentals, put the customer in the center of everything. But do you think now it's actually forced businesses to really do that, given all what's changed in the last 12 months?
I think for some, I think the ones who already kind of had that customer centricity probably were able to pivot quicker, and it probably wasn't as big a pivot. So I think there were probably already some, like, use the instant messenger as an example. I think there are a lot of businesses that had it around or were toying with it and have just, ramped it up and, moved a bunch of their customer service operatives to man those rather than man the phones, because they can get through a lot more customers and resolve a lot more issues through them, as well as then potentially implementing AI solutions within that as well. That's a whole other conversation. But I think the ones that were maybe behind are now have had to make a massive adjustment to actually bring any of those technologies in the last month, and that's maybe where they haven't had the best experience. So yeah, I think customer centricity is probably a pretty good barometer of how well the pandemic has gone for some brands.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting measurement, isn't it? That in itself, like that kind of measure of how successful have you been in that. But I completely agree. I think that is what my agency's seen, as those organisations that already had the foundations in place, really quick to pivot and adjust. Those that didn't and had been putting it off for some time, it's like a huge mountain to climb in a really short space of time, in a very competitive time period. So yeah, I completely agree. So how do you think changes in legislation, such as the likes of, dare I say, GDPR, have had on the impacts of businesses and marketing?
GDPR is not a dirty word or a dirty phrase, dirty collection of letters. I think I joined the DMA not long after that text was finalised, so I've never known a non-GDPR world at the DMA.
Amazing.
But, we've been tracking the concerns and sentiment about particularly GDPR, but also more generally about some of the other legislation that's been discussed, like e-privacy, which is still kind of slightly up in the air. Since the final text was agreed back in 2016, the major shift over that time has been in the number of organizations really recognizing actually the benefits of the new laws once they were implemented. I think there was a lot of nervousness before, as can be expected, but after that implementation date and the necessary changes, a lot of businesses started then to see that actually there was clear benefit, because it did put the customer at the heart of their data strategy and put their kind of privacy and data protection right as a core value. And a lot of the principles that are in GDPR, frankly, mirror inadvertently to some extent the core tenets of our code of practice at the DMA as well. There are still clearly concerns around how compliant every organization necessarily is, and particularly among the smaller and medium businesses. Actually, we did a piece of work last year that really highlighted that, and I think that comes less down to want and more just down to resource and the ability and knowledge within those teams. But broadly speaking, most businesses have taken the steps required to become compliant with the new laws that they need, and they're seeing the positive benefits of being more kind of more data literate as well as part of that.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a huge amount of awareness. We still get asked a lot about GDPR when we're implementing anything, and there's always the question of, are we okay to do this in GDPR? And that was the ultimate goal, right? For everybody to be really thinking about this. And I think that has been a huge shift in the last 2 years since it's been in place, that just being on the radar and having it in the conversation regularly it's great that that's still the case and it hasn't just kind of died off.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's brilliant. Okay, so what do you think are the most common pitfalls a marketer faces and how can they overcome them?
I think some of the biggest ones are, I mentioned it at the beginning actually, so just not listening to your customers, and just kind of constantly marketing at them rather than to them or with them potentially as well. And then there's lots to unpack there, whether that's actually taking on their feedback, taking on feedback from your customer service representatives, who can be invaluable in actually giving that color to what you might be able to see in the data, and as well as boots on the ground store people, when all stores are kind of reopen again now, to some extent, but when that starts to return to full normality. The other one that I see a lot in the research that we do, as I think you'll know as well, Jenna, is the belief that us as marketers are like our customers. I think that's the biggest misnomer we have. It's completely natural. It's total human instinct. But you always have to remember that as marketers, we are a case study of one, and that actually by going to the data and talking to customers and listening to what they're telling us, we can truly understand. One of the kind of joke examples that we get to use every year is the number of normal people who have a work email address. Because we as marketers all expect, well, everybody does. Of course we all do. Well, half of normal people don't have any kind of work email address. Now, there are lots of potential drivers behind that, but that means half of people have a fundamentally different relationship with email as the key channel to the other half who have to operate with it in a work context on a daily basis. Those are going to be different people and different types of relationships with that channel. Lastly is, I've mentioned it already, but I'm going to say it again, it's data and being able to use it intelligently within organizations. I think it's all very well to collect it, but actually knowing how to then analyze it, use it, and to actually do something off the back of it is often the pitfall. Seeing things like, I don't know, our open rates are going up and that's great. It's like, well, fantastic, but what's that translating to? Why is that happening? And what can you then do to go further and start to improve metrics that matter, all the way back to the bottom line, and understand what drives that as well.
Less than half of people not having a work email address just blows my mind. But you're completely right. There's the assumptions that are made through a lack of data and research can be really quite dangerous, because we live in a completely different world as marketers to the general public. And even just having a conversation with my mum about tracking and Google Analytics and things, it was just like, really, you can see all of that. It's just, we take that for granted as just a second nature, but to the general public, they wouldn't even have thought that was even possible. There's quite a big gap there. So yeah, you're completely right. I mean, the research piece plays in massively in that.
Definitely.
So from the experience that you've gained, because you've got a really broad background and scientific background to really crunch those numbers, but also to glean those insights and actually have those insights represent something. What advice would you give yourself first starting out?
Yeah, looking back at the younger me, first of all would be value your hair.
I knew you were going to make a comment about
that. But on a more serious note, I think don't be afraid to be interested, and to ask questions. I think as a more junior person coming in, maybe I was slightly nervous at times about asking the awkward questions or wanting to understand maybe how things work. I think luckily, where I started out, I was able to do that kind of after meetings and not necessarily in front of clients and things. But I think it's don't be afraid to be interested and want to know how things work. That's how we learn, it's how we get to understand, and it's how we get to then potentially make improvements and grow as well as both individuals and organizations. So yeah, always be interested.
Yeah, great advice. Always asking questions. Being curious, I think, is like really
Yeah,
quite key, isn't it?
definitely. That curiosity, I think, is pretty much what's got me to where I am. Just naturally, yeah, being curious about how things work and what they. I mean, it's ostensibly what my job is now. It's just being curious about everything around our industry.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks so much, Tim, and thanks so much for contributing to the book as well. It's been a pleasure to speak to you.
Pleasure. Thanks a lot, Jenna.